Oh, what a day! What a lovely day!
Hey guys, Jim here. Welcome in once again, and it was only a matter of time. It was only a matter of time before I got my hands on a Rosie, and now that I have, I got some shit to say about it. There is a lot to cover in this review. Why? Because the Oz Machine Roosevelt may well be the most hyped knife that we have seen in the past few years. And we've gone through a lot of hyped knives in our history together, you and I, over the last decade. And you go back to the Hinderers, my God, the XM18, when you could not get an XM18, and that $425 knife would cost you $1,000 day in and day out, and that lasted for year and a half, 2 years? That was absolutely insane. Going back to when you had a really hard time getting your hands on a Sabenza, even a plain Jane. We go back that far together. We've watched the Grimsmo Norseman come and go with its popularity. Now, you could pretty much go to their website almost any time and get one. You don't have to spend $1,500 for a $550 knife, which is what we had to do back about 7, 8 years ago. 9 years, my God, 9 years ago now. And of course, the Shirogorov thing. When the first Shirogorovs hit, the production Shirogorovs, the F95T. Remember those? Yeah, those were $525. Our silly asses were spending $800, $900, even $1,000 to get them. So how is the Roosevelt different? Well, in that regard, not very different. This is a knife that you can buy at a really good maker price for the base versions, and then they do go up pretty expensive into the $800, $900 range. But you're going to pay double and triple on the internet, on the secondary, because people really, really enjoy screwing people over. But does that mean the knife isn't worth owning? Well, we're going to explore that. Does it mean that you shouldn't be using your knife because it's an investment grade knife? We're going to discuss that as well. So join me on this little field trip as we explore the Rosie and everything that makes her wonderful and everything that's going to curl your fucking toes. All right, boys and girls, here we go. We are about ready to hop into the Oz Machine Company Roosevelt. A machine custom knife, small batch release that start at $700 and work their way up. Now, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to break this up into a few different segments mentally, and I might stray back and forth a little bit, but we're going to start talking about, obviously, the specs in the very beginning. We're going to talk about the knife. We're going to talk about the owner and the maker of these knives and the design of the knife, the functionality, my opinions on the knife. And then we're going to talk a little bit about secondary market pricing, how to validate it, if it should be validated at all, and what makes this knife special, and if it's worth it to you to spend the money and go on the chase that these knives require. So without any further ado, let's get the packaging open. And this is what you'll be greeted with. You get a sticker right here put in behind your COA, which lists the model name, your individually numbered knife, the date that it was manufactured, the blade, steel, and any other notable things as far as the milling pattern that's done, or if it's a plain Jane, or if it's anodized. That'll be listed on there, and then Daniel also signs each one. Now, I'm not going to pry this out of there because it's actually very creatively put in here. It's got these little satin ribbons, and it just kind of wedges in there. It's really nice packaging, very clean, very professional looking, and adds to the pride of ownership on a knife like this. All right, let's get that out of the way. And there she is. Before we start anything else, just take a look at how this thing, how it opens and closes and how smooth and sweet it really is. Now, out of the box, this thing was fantastic. And I have spent the last week or so relentlessly flicking it and breaking it in. And it has actually gotten smoother and faster. Now, like any other knife with bearings, you do not lubricate the knife. You don't need to. It is completely unnecessary. Once this thing is broken in, it is an absolute dream as far as the action goes. So let's get into the specs first and foremost. We're talking about a titanium frame lock with an overall length of 7 inches. Your blade length is about 3 inches, and it's a full flat grind, but it's not done on a grinder. It's actually ground on his CNC machine. Beautifully machine ground and then hand finished. So he removes all the tooling marks. Everything that's on this knife comes out to be perfect looking in the end. It's not just a machined knife that's put out there for you to see all the tool paths and everything else. No, he puts a lot of work into these knives. He's done some as very high-end blade finishes. Excuse me, didn't mean to bang the camera there, and other things. So there's a lot of work that goes into these beyond just machining them, and we're going to talk about that as well. The blade thickness is 125 thousandths of an inch. This particular example does use MagnaCut, and he has done runs of different blade steel. So I don't want you to think he's limiting it to only one blade steel. This particular example, this is the absolute newest run as to the date of this video recording. This particular one is MagnaCut. You get a steel lock bar insert. You've got ceramic bearings, and you've got 2 ceramic detents. We'll discuss why in a little bit. He is using Peter's heat treat for his heat treating, so it's very, very accurate, high performance heat treating. It's extremely expensive. I used to use Peter's before I started doing my own heat treat, and at one point they weren't all that crazily expensive. Then basically I think they just decided, hey, we don't want to service the small individual knife maker anymore, so the only time you're going to start getting price discounts is sending in hundreds and hundreds of blades, and that knocks out little guys like me. And it got to be so expensive that you couldn't fit it into your pricing. So but they are still the best. It's Peters and Boz, period. They are the best. And once again, the prices start at $700. Now, how do you buy one of these? Well, that's really, really difficult. These are not as hard to get as people want to make you think, because he is doing weekly batches. That's right. These are offered in lottery form weekly. Now, it's small batches, but you have a chance weekly to get in on them. So all you do is you follow his website, and every week he puts up a new batch, and you sign up for the lotto, and if your lucky name gets drawn, you just buy the knife and you're off to the races. It's just that simple. It's not an overly complex type of thing. These are made by Daniel Osborne out of Indiana. You could say he's the Wizard of Oz. Yeah, there's going to be lots of dad jokes here. I will say this, while we're getting into this. I'm very disappointed with one particular thing. Here you've got a guy named Daniel Osborne. He chooses to name his company Oz Machine Company instead of Oscorp. And I think that's a crime. And honestly, I think you should very seriously consider buying a knife from somebody who doesn't take an opportunity like that. I would have absolutely called my company Oscorp, and I would have rolled with that. But anyway, that's just my personal thing. These are made by way of a 4-axis CNC, and it is a masterfully machined knife. It's cleanly machined, well finished by hand afterwards. He's done hand rub satins. He's done all kinds of different finishes. And that really is the key. You're not seeing what you see in a lot of machined custom knives these days. He is putting in the work and making sure that every knife is as special as it can be. As a matter of fact, I don't think this guy takes very much time off, because part of the delay for me getting this video out is I wanted to get as much information directly from Dan as possible, not just rely on shit that you read on the internet and everything else. So I had my typical list of questions that I have for knife makers, and a few specific ones as well. And man, there were days that would go by that he hadn't read it yet, and he'll kind of pop online and then he pops right back offline, and I kind of think he sort of lives out of his shop. So I am glad to have finally gotten the chance to get the answers from him, and we'll discuss a little bit more of that as we go along. Now, you might be kind of thinking, if you're newer to knives, well, even the $800, or excuse me, $700 and up that's being charged on these, this particular example is $750. That's a lot of money if it's made on CNC. Well, that's the thing. A CNC does not spit out a complete working knife. It also doesn't spit out parts that are ready to go either. And there are some makers out there that will do just the minimum amount of work just to clean it up after machining, and then make the knife, and then it's done. But Daniel isn't like that. I have looked this knife over inside and out, and it's just really clean. Beautifully done. I don't see any flaws. I don't see any tool marks. It's cleaned up very, very well. If you didn't see telltale things like this crazy plunge, which could not be done by using a grinder. If anybody doing a handmade knife were doing this, they would have to carve this once they've set in their plunge, and grind the knife and then carve that by hand. But as far as getting that particular shape out of your plunge, you're not going to be able to do that on a grinder. It would just be insane. There's no way to do that. And again, this is a full flat grind. It goes down nice and thin. It's not precariously thin. It's not razor thin, but this is extraordinarily sharp, and it has no problem slicing through shit at all. I mean, it is a good, solid performer. So yes, it is worth the money, because you've got somebody that sat down, forget all the time it took to design the knife. That's, always kind of bundled in. You've got somebody that had to write all the code, make the machine do all of those different operations, have the skill and the knowledge in order to do that. And then once all of those individual parts have been cut, then go and clean them all up. Then go and assemble them in a way where everything works together. Tuning that lock bar tension, tuning the detent, tuning the action perfectly, making sure all the parts mate together properly. There's no burrs, there's no harsh edges. Everything is softened. Everything is made to be ergonomic and comfortable, and then to present a really, really nice finish. So this is a very labor-intensive knife, more so than I would have thought just by seeing pictures and video. That's why it's taken me so long to make this video, because I needed to have one in my hands, because I didn't fully understand the hype behind this particular knife until I had it in my hand. And I knew that I had to do that. And we've gone through this together a lot, most recently with the Winter Blade Factor. I went, man, I don't understand the insane amount of hype behind this knife. And it was once I had it in my hand that I went, okay, shit, now I get it. And that's exactly what I went through with the Roosevelt. I want to talk about the design for a little bit now. I will say this, and I have to be honest in my critique here. Before getting it in my hand, seeing many hundreds of images from both Dan himself on his website and his Instagram, but also other collectors, watching pretty much every review that's been done on this knife, one of the things that really irked me was the angle on the front of the frame. Because when you look at it, it's angled rearward. Now, when you're looking at something, I've designed stuff for half my life at this point now. When you look at something from a design standpoint, if you're seeing it sitting there still and static, this looks like it almost has a rearward lean to it, or a rearward movement feeling. In most anything, if you see movement in a static design, it should represent forward momentum. So leaning that, if it wasn't flat, or straight I should say, leaning it a little bit forward would give you that feeling of forward momentum. But the way the frame front leans back, it feels like it shows a rearward movement, or like it's falling backward off balance. And that really, it really did mess with my head a lot. And you can see it's really pronounced right now at this angle. And I was having a hard time dealing with that, especially because the rear of the frame does come forward just a little bit. So it was kind of doing this, and I'm like, oh, I don't really know if I dig that. But I'll tell you this. In person, in your hand, you don't see that. It's really only prevalent in pictures and in videos. The other thing, my eye was going so hard to this and to that very unique plunge, to the shape of the rear and the very far offset pivot, that I didn't even notice that this wasn't a straight back knife. It has a wonderful curvature to it. Really, really nicely done. As a matter of fact, it's really worth noting that that curved top spine from tip to butt is extremely ergonomic, as is the finger choil up here, actually both finger choils, and the overall shape. So that when you put this in your hand, the way it's intended to be held, and yes, you could hold it back here and get a little bit more reach, but the way it's intended to be held, it falls into the shape of your hand perfectly. I did not expect that. I really kind of looked at this as a very basic titanium frame lock, like so many others that are out there. And it's when you put it in your hand that you begin to realize all the incredible work and the thoughtfulness that went into this design. Now, there are a few knife makers out there that have their pivot offset, and they're usually done for knives that are set up to be flicked like this, or have a flipper that's not very far in front of the pivot. And what that does, and I failed geometry in high school, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm as smart as Dan on anything that has to do with fucking numbers. But the correlation to the position of the pivot to where the detents are and how far forward the pivot is in the body of the frame, having it down this low gives you a certain degree of leverage that creates a very, very snappy action, and one that swings the blade out so it always goes to full lock. So there is a reason for that pivot being set so far down. And if you can get past that visually, and I'll tell you this right now, after a few minutes of having the knife in your hand, you almost don't notice it anymore. So that's not really a thing unless you're just ogling the pictures and videos and talking yourself in or out of buying this knife. That's the only time you're really going to notice that. Once it's in your possession, you really honestly, you kind of forget where the pivot is. But again, he's not the only guy that does that. I just see his as one of the most extreme examples. It is so far south on that frame, more so than I think I've seen with anybody else. So that's my take on the design. Overall, the ergonomics of it, the jimping is perfect. It's a wide tooth jimping that goes all the way into the frame He did a great job by putting the jimping exactly where your thumb is going to be. This is one of the models that has a top swedge. They do not all have top swedges. And as I was talking earlier about, handwork that gets done, that top swedge is hand ground. Now, I haven't verified that with Dan, but I've made enough knives in my time to know that is a hand ground top swedge, and I'll show you why. Take a look. I don't know if the camera is quite going to focus on it. It really wants to focus on my background. There we go. It is not 100% symmetrical, and this one cuts in a little bit more aggressively, and this one sweeps in a little bit more softly. I love that, because that shows me that while this is a machine custom knife, there is hand custom work being done. Now, I would be totally fine if Dan wanted to correct me and go, no, it was machine ground, but the machine was a bit off, or the end mill broke during the process or something, and I could be off, but that looks like a hand ground swedge to me. And that just shows me that, furthermore, that it is worth the price that you're paying at maker price. I love the size. I'm not really a huge fan of small knives, but this is a small knife that feels and acts like it's much larger than it is. As a matter of fact, this is a good time to go ahead and do some size comparisons. When I put it up against another 3-inch blade knife like the EMP EDC Nimble, you'll see that overall they're very close in size, almost nearly identical. But the Nimble feels and acts a lot smaller than this does. There's less belly to the blade, there's less length to the actual cutting edge, because the finger choil is so far forward into the blade, whereas this one is not. You've got a knife that feels much larger than it really is. Putting it up against the Winter Blade Factor, which there are so many reasons to compare the two. The way they carry is very similar. The thicknesses and everything else, very similar on that. Winter Blade Factor should be pretty much identical in size. Yes, it is almost 100% identical in size, and they're both tall, thin knives as well. And that'll take you a little bit of getting used to be perfectly honest. I like how that feels, but that's because I've had other knives already for a long time that I'm kind of used to that. If this is the very first slab-sided, flat, slim, and wide knife that you're getting your hands on, it'll take a little bit of getting used to. Let's get that out of the way, get that nimble closed before I cut myself. Up against a little bit of a larger knife here is the upcoming Relative from EMP EDC. This is his prototype. It's not out yet. And this is only a 3.5-inch blade, and it looks like it dwarfs the Oz. But let's bring the blades back where they're matching up to where their cutting edge starts, where the heel of the edge is. And you see it's not a huge difference. The way that he has designed this allows the knife to seem a lot larger than it is. Here's another small knife for comparison. We'll go ahead and put the Rosie down here. Here is the Pinion Knives Mula. This was the Sons of Liberty collaboration. The Mula is a tiny knife, but yet look how much larger it looks in comparison. That's a 3.25-inch blade. But it's also sleeker. It's slimmer, not slimmer. It's narrower than the height of the Roosevelt. This would look like a teeny tiny knife, yet here it is. I wear large and sometimes extra large motorcycle gloves. And that's how it fits in my paw. It's not as small as it seems. Put up against another small knife that was designed to be small and to be lightweight and to be very tough. There is the Avian Knives Atlas. This is quite a bit longer, but it's much sleeker. This is going to be a great utility knife, and this is as well, but there's just something about that substantial size in the hand that doesn't allow it to feel delicate. Now, while we know that the Atlas is not delicate in any way, it has that delicate feeling because of how sleek and skinny it is. Let's get some weights out of the way while we're doing all this. 3.1 ounces versus 4.3, 3.6, 3.7. Wow, I didn't realize that was going to be heavier. The closest is the winter blade factor. And half of the knife is carbon fiber. So once again, the knife is deceiving. You wouldn't imagine the size or the weight just by looking at it. Now, let's get into a little bit about Dan and the origins of this knife. I asked Dan, I'm like, you know what? I said, I think I've watched pretty much every video that exists on this knife, and unless I dozed off in some of those reviews, and a couple I did, I've missed where the hell did the name come from? Because I didn't know if it was the obvious named after Teddy Roosevelt or if there was something else going on. He's like, yeah. He goes, I named it after Teddy Roosevelt. He's my personal hero. He's my favorite president, and he was an all-around American badass. And you know what? That's a perfect reason to name your knife. Great way of going about it. I'm not being sarcastic. That's really where the name comes from. Dan was a full-time machinist by trade and decided to take his skills in knife making like some other extremely talented knife makers, guys like Todd Begg, for example. He was a machinist for over 20 years, or 20 years at the time, and then began making knives, and he's been doing that for 25 some odd years or so. And he took what he knew about machining, brought it into knife making, and this gives him an understanding of precision and an eye for extreme detail. Now, as he was designing the Rosie, he spent countless hours on YouTube and kept refining his design based on what he heard people saying they liked and disliked about certain knives. His basic goal was to make the knife as small as possible, as light as possible, making something very slicey, but also usable by someone with large-sized hands. That was the main goal. Somebody with large hands that could carry the smallest knife that will still be useful. And it really, honestly, he nailed it. I think he really, really nailed it. He started out with cardboard cutouts, kept feeling it, kept seeing how it was going to play in the hand. Then he went to 3D printing. All that before he ever cut the first parts. And here's the funny part. He wanted to work his way up, honing his machining skills to be able to make knives as his main business. And he did that to the point where he made a couple of prototypes of the Roosevelt, and he just attended Blade Show 2019 and brought a few of the prototypes with him. And he would hand it to people, knife makers, knife collectors, knife users, and put it in their hand and ask them to be extremely critical, because he wanted to come home with all of these ideas in his head. I need to change this. I need to change this. I need to do this better. I need to do that better. I need to make this more comfortable, or I need to make the blade shape more like this. And instead what he got, and I'm sure he got a little bit of critiquing, but mainly what he got was people fawning over it to the point where they would force him to sell them his prototypes, and he went home without any fucking knives. I mean, how cool is that? That's great. And that's got to give you a great confidence boost to come home from a big show like that and so many people enjoying what you put in their hand. The man sat up the night before the show started in his Airbnb, putting the edges on the knives. That's how down to the wire he ran it. I love how this feels. And I'm a recent lover of that reverse flick. Now, I've always been a flipper person, or a slow roller, or a thumb flicker. This is not a good thumb flicker, I'll tell you that right now. The shape of that window does not lend itself well to your thumb flicking it. It was the primary design purpose was for it to be reverse flicked. And it does that exceedingly well. I mean, one of my favorite story reverse flick is my Nimble. And while that one's great, it's not as fast. It's not as snappy. Let's see how the relative works in comparison. Yeah, the relative's a lot slower. You have a lot more mass here, too, by the way. Let's just get that out of the way. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. I mean, this is 125 thou thick. That is not a thick blade. I forgot. I think this is 165, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, I mean, there's a substantial difference there. What else we have? I think I'd be fairly close to the Winter Blade Factor. That's still my favorite flickable knife, as well as flipper. But, yeah, they are remarkably similar. Oh, that lockup. Did you hear that? Great lockup. I'm enjoying this knife way, 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 way too much. I tell you that right now. Now, I promised I would discuss why he's using 2 detent balls. And I didn't realize, but he had this outlined on his website. I don't know if I can get you a view in there. Let's get the camera to focus up really tight. And you should see, yep, there they are. There's the 2 detent balls right there. You see that smooth transition? That's what it's all about right there. That's why he's using 2 detent balls. I didn't realize that he had that outlined on his website. So I actually asked him, like, why the 2 detent balls? That sounds kind of crazy. Why would anybody do that? And he basically said the same thing that he has written on his website, that the 2 balls are to let the blade drop off of the closest one to the lock face, and then it will immediately go straight into the locked open position. So he's not having to use detent ramps or anything like that, and he's keeping the detents as close to the edge as he possibly can. And the main reason for that was, he says, if you were to crack, let's say a typical detent is going to be pressed into your lock bar, right? If you crack that detent ball, it's going to be really, 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 really hard to repair that. What he's doing is he's putting both of those 2 detent balls, he's insetting them into the steel lock bar insert, which, by the way, is hardened AEBL, by the way, in case I didn't mention it. That way, if you were to crack one of the ceramic balls, all he does is he just simply unscrews the lock bar insert and replaces the lock bar insert that already has 2 press fit balls in it and sends it right back to you. Nice and simple. I mean, again, that's the machinist mindset, is how to make things as simple as possible that will work properly and not be a huge pain in the ass. Now, Dan makes every part of this knife in-house. That's something else that you need to factor in when you're looking at pricing. Every single component of this knife is made in-house except for the bearings themselves. And guess what? When I talked to him about 2 hours ago, he says he's working on doing that at this very moment. He's developing his own bearings right now. So very shortly, instead of being 99% made in-house, it's going to be 100% of all parts made in-house. He's turning his own screws. Every component in this knife is made in his shop. Folks, that is a lot of dedication. That's a lot of investment. I'm glad that these are selling out as quickly as they are for him, because it was a major investment to tool up to do all of this. You're waiting for me to cut myself on that edge, aren't you? That's a big investment, and it's a big leap of faith. So I'm really glad that it's paying off for him. What else do I want to talk about as far as the knife goes before we get off into the secondary market pricing and how I feel about if you should really own one or not? You know what? Let's just get straight into that, because that really is the elephant in the room, isn't it? Here's the funny thing. Is it worth owning? I promised you we would talk about in the intro, is it worth owning? Let's talk about that first. When I come at it from my perspective as a longtime collector, taking being a knife maker out of it, just being a longtime collector, I started my early life in production knives, then I jumped into customs, and my mainstay is custom and mid-tech. And while, yes, I am certainly very much enjoying a lot of production knives these days, it's because they've upped the ante. They've made their way into being a more refined product, more like a mid-tech or custom. So when I look at it from my perspective, I see it as a solid $500 to $550 knife. Now, wait. The increases in the cost of materials, the difficulty in the manufacturing, and the above and beyond handwork that he's putting into these, I realize that the price easily crept up to that $700 price point. And I can absolutely say without a doubt, it's worth every penny that the maker is charging for certain. 100%. If you're able to get one of these at table price, I would tell you absolutely do it without hesitation. This will be one of your favorite knives that you have ever owned. And I cannot stress that enough. It is that impressive. And you're thinking, well, I mean, Jim, it's just a titanium frame lock. I've already got 35 of those. This is unlike any other knife that you've got, I promise. In the way that it feels, the way that it presents itself, the way the action works, those detent balls, the way that... This is not a hard detent. There was a time where we had to request from a custom knife maker, give me a hard detent. That way it would flip like a rocket. This is not a hard detent at all. It works exceedingly well, but it's not a hard detent at all. But it's a crisp, sharp detent that works perfectly. Realize this. When the Grimsmo Norseman came out, they were $550. Today, they're $800 to $900 in the standard versions. The cost of materials has skyrocketed over the last few years. Titanium is more expensive. Almost every steel that there is more expensive. The heat treating costs associated with making these knives, everything is more expensive. So 10 years ago, I would have said this is a solid $500 to $550 knife, just like 10 years ago the Norseman was. Today the Norseman is $800 to $900, and this is worth every bit of the $700 to $750 that this particular knife is. Absolutely 100% easily justifiable once it's in your hand. Now, those that are new to knife collecting, and this has brought a lot of newbies into it, people that may have only ever owned production knives, somehow found out about this knife, and this is their first foray into a difficult to get knife. They believe that this is a rare knife that deserves double to triple maker prices on the secondary market. They weren't around for the Grimsmo Norseman in the beginning, when that $550 knife, you were spending $1,000 plus to get your hands on it. That doesn't happen anymore. They weren't around for the launch of the Shirogorov brand. You might remember when Shirogorov was first introducing their production. I'm not talking about their customs or their custom shop. I'm talking about their production knives. They were $525 for an F95T. We were spending $850 to $900 to get them because they were imported in small numbers, and at that particular time only by one distributor, and he was the worst to possibly deal with and made it impossible to get them. He would sit on hundreds of knives at a time and just build up inventory. And he was doing a De Beers is what he was doing. He was doing a diamond trade thing. He was holding on to everything and hoarding it and forcing the value up. And now, you're spending the appropriate price for a Shirogorov. Now again, the materials and everything else have gone up. They're not $525 anymore, but you are paying the right price for them now because the market balanced out. Then go back to when whole blade works hit the market. Oh my God, talk about insane prices. A $600 knife that you pay $1,500 and more for. And people running to their table. They would bring like 150 knives. They'd be sold out in 30 seconds. They couldn't make as many. They weren't making enough knives. Dan's making enough knives. He's doing a really good job putting out. I mean, what number is this? This is 939, which, by the way, I absolutely love this. This is so clever. Come on, focus. That is so clever, where he's got his brand marking and the limited edition number. And, by the way, shows that it's Magna Cut right there as well. None of that is visible with the knife open. See, this is what I'm saying. It's these little touches that prevent it from being like any other knife that you've ever seen. All those simple little things that you take for granted when you start pricing things out. Listen, price volatility like this settles very quickly and investment is lost. I joined up with the Facebook group that Dan has for Oz Machine. And there are a lot of really good people in there. I know a lot of really knowledgeable people. And then there's also a good amount of people that are really new to this shit. And they're acting like absolute idiots. And some of them acting like assholes. We'll watch them brag that they got 2 knives from the lottery and then immediately sell one for double the price. And then everybody else they're gagging over it. Okay, I'll buy it. I'll trade this harder to get custom that's worth more for that knife that you shouldn't have been able to get 2 of. By the way, I don't care. I ain't crying about that. I don't care if one person got 50 of them. What I'm saying is, in that group, they're just allowing that shit to go on and rewarding people for doing shit like that. They're being sharks and you're rewarding them for it. It makes no sense to me. I've never seen that. Yes, I've seen people flip knives for more money even before they even receive the knife. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I've never seen a group that watches people do it and goes, okay, yeah, I'll give you the money. I'll reward you for that shit. That's asinine. But I've also seen a couple people come out there and go, I've been trying to get my hands on one of these. I've tried my luck at the lottery for months now, and I can't seem to get one. Whether they can afford or justify or whatever the secondary market price may be on that particular afternoon. They're like, is there anybody willing to sell me one at or close to maker price? And I have seen many times people go up, you know what? I have a couple of these knives. I'm happy to sell one to you. And they may not always vocalize that in the thread, but what you'll see is that guy, a few days later, he'll post up and go, I'm so glad I've got my first Roosevelt. Thank you to so-and-so, a fellow member, who sold it to me for maker price. So yeah, that's the way it's supposed to be. And that's the way a lot of those people in that group are. And there are some really good people in that group. I don't want to act like I'm, bashing the entire group. I'm not. It's a handful of people that are making it unpleasant. But there's also just a handful of people that have an ignorance to how this industry works just because they haven't been around it for very long. They're very new to it. They think this is a rare knife. It's not. I mean, you guys know my collection. I have knives that, there's one of it, period. That's it. And that maker will only make one. It was made by hand and it took them 2 months to make it and shit like that. Or there's rare machine customs that, go back to the original bodegas. My God, for their entire run, their entire history of bodegas in that original run, there was only 200, period. That's over like a 2 or 3 year period. That's it. And people, back then in 2012 were like, oh, I can't believe that's an $850 knife. Well, it also had 40 hours worth of handwork in it too. But that was a rare knife. That was hard to get. So when somebody sold one for $1,200 or $1,500, it was a little easier to justify it. Because you're not going to see one. These are popping up on drops on a weekly basis. Okay? So to watch people turning around and just profiting like mad, I get making maybe like $100 because it was worth your effort to do it, and you're having to repackage it and reship it, and there's a risk involved in that. I get that, man. That's cool. But you're buying a $750 knife in this particular example, and then, well, my wife got one too. Well, she didn't like it. I'll sell you mine for $1,400. And then people are gagging for it in the replies. Be patient. We've seen this with Hinderer. When the Hinderers first came out, XM18s, that $425 knife was going for $800, $900, even $1,000 because the supply could not meet the demand at the time. Then what happened? The supply met the demand. He caught up. He made more knives. And now you're buying them, well, now they're $475, but when he caught up, you were buying them for $425. You were buying them for the right price. Nobody was buying secondary market. And those guys that had a $1,000 XM18, guess what? They never, ever, ever got their money back. No, for some people, they just went, I paid that much just because I really wanted the knife. It doesn't matter to them. But that guy that went, well, I'm buying it because it really is a good investment. I know it's always going to be worth what I paid. No, it's not. Talk to anybody around in the knife collecting in the 1980s. They were buying up Italian stilettos for $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 that they had a hard time selling them for $300 5 years later. That was a whole big thing, and that was the first time we really saw this happen. So don't fall into that trap because the prices will level out. This is not an investment grade knife. You're not buying a Ron Best handmade custom that your version, there's only going to be one ever made, okay? You're buying a machine custom, a fantastically made machine custom with great precision, incredible performance, fantastic ergonomics, an absolutely must-own knife. Don't get me wrong. You must own one of these knives, but it's not a must-own right this very second if it's going to cost you this one. If this one's going to cost you $1,500, no. Wait a year or two. And when Daniel has made enough, when he's made 2,000-3,000 of these knives, and he's found new ways to either become more efficient, or he's added more machines, or he's added more employees in the shop, just like the Grimsmos did, go from making, 500 knives a year to 2,000 or 3,000 knives a year, then guess what? Ta-da! It'll be $750. But if you paid $1,500 today, in 2 years, you're going to be selling it for $750 or less. And that's just the way it is. So keep that in mind. If you're buying it simply because, like how I'm feeling about this knife right now personally, going, I just friggin' love this knife, and you're like, I have to have one of these because it's going to be my main EDC, spend whatever you want. I'm not telling you not to. But if you're buying it thinking it's worth that double to triple maker price, don't fall into that trap. We've seen it time and time again, over and over and over and over again. I've seen people pay, these were, $375, $385, something like that. And only a handful have gone out in that first run, and I've seen people paying as much as $600, $700. Well, they're doing it because it's the only way they can get it, and they really, really, really want to experience it. I haven't seen anybody buying them to flip them yet. But Brian's about ready to release the second run very shortly, and there's going to be a whole bunch of them out there. And you're going to look at it and go, damn, if I just would have waited a couple more months, I could have had a factor for $375. Instead, I spent $600. And you kind of kick yourself in the butt every now and for stupid shit like that. So just take the historical data and realize that while these are very hard to get and you really, really want one and you're willing to pay a little bit more, don't overextend yourself in the hopes that it's still going to be worth something near to close to that in the future, because it's not going to be. Because he's going to still keep making these. I asked him if he has any plans for a brand new model anytime in the next year or so. No. He's going to keep making Roosevelts. I said, are there going to be any significant changes to the Roosevelt? No. There's going to be obviously generational advancements. There always is. But no. A year, 2 years down the road, you're still going to be buying these. He's still going to be making them. He's still going to be making them available. So just keep trying your luck, man. Or find the nice guy, find the right guy that'll sell it to you for the right price. That's all. Great stone wash on this fantastic edge. Love the top swedge. Not all of them have them, but this one does. I love it. The golf putter pattern was my particular favorite. There's also another one that's, I don't know what he names it, but there's just these separated curved lines that I think looks very, very handsome as well. It's almost like concentric circles, but you're not seeing the other half of the circles. Very cool. Backspacer fit is fantastic. Blind screwed pocket clip with the perfect amount of tension. Lock bar relief on the outside with, again, the perfect amount of tension. Everything is chamfered to be very comfortable in the hand. Lots of internal pocketing makes this knife extraordinarily lightweight. The lockup is perfect. The action is perfect. The way that everything feels. Everything that you engage on this knife really is well thought out and perfectly executed. I love the new flat hardware. This was one of the first batches to release with the flat hardware. I think maybe it's only been around for a month or so before this. Definitely prefer the flat pivot over proud pivots always. Especially on a slab-sided knife. Want everything to be flat. That's exactly how it is. So overall, is this a knife that you should add to your collection? Abso-friggin-lutely. Do what you can to search one out or keep trying his lotteries, try your luck, and try to get one. Should you be paying $1,300, $1,500, $1,800, or trading a $2,000 custom? And only you can really determine that. It depends on your particular wants, but don't think that it's going to be worth that in a year or two, because it simply won't be. And again, this is not a guesstimate. This is watching similar made customs and mid-techs offered in the same ways, and actually not offered in weekly batches, by the way, on any of those, but watching their business model and watching how they grew and seeing exactly what happened to the prices. It's going to happen. So if you're just in a position, you've got a big family to support, you've got a lot of things that you're taking care of, and you're like, I just can't justify spending over $1,000 as much as I want that knife. Be patient, because soon you're going to be able to get one at the maker price, and you'll be able to justify it. You're going to hold that in your hand the very first time. The first time I pulled this knife out of the box, and I went, damn. So yeah, this is a must-own. This should be in every knife collector's collection. Even if you don't like small knives. I was never really a huge fan of small knives, but I have a place for them. This knife feels and performs so much larger than it is. I don't want you to think that because you've got a 3-inch blade that you've got a small knife, because you do not. It's like the baby Huey of knives, which I can't say that because Mick Strider made a baby Huey, but you know what I'm saying. It's a grown up. It's a baby in a grown up body. There's something peculiar about it that makes this wonderfully unique. So that was my thoughts. I didn't really think that I would be this impressed with the knife. I knew I would like it. I just didn't think I'd be this impressed. This is going to be one of my top picks for the year. No doubt about it. It is just that awesome. And for those of you that said, oh, Jim, you're so late to the party. You're 2 years late into the party and yada, 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 3 years late almost. I had to get the knife, and I had to spend time with the knife, and I had to talk to the maker. I didn't want to just wing it and go, here's the specs, and then make a whole bunch of mouth noises every time I flicked it open, because the knife deserves more than that. And I think Dan deserves more than that. And if you're into supporting American-made products, you're into supporting a small business, and putting money directly into a maker's pocket, this is a really good option to go with. This is a knife that will not disappoint you. I can absolutely guarantee you that 1,000%. Anyway, them's my thoughts. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you guys for joining me for a full hour. My goodness gracious. And I'll see you on the next video.